Good afternoon, morning, or night, wherever and whenever you are. Welcome back to another episode of Tech Stew, the show that discusses the best of everything tech, computers, home theater, gaming, science, and more. I am Mark Murin, and we have been away for a few weeks making some system upgrades, but we are back online and ready for new stew. And we've got a bunch of things to talk about today. And one of the first things breaking into the news stories recently is that of Microsoft Blue coming in the next several months. We'll start to see some pre-releases in a couple of months, beta testing. Blue is going to be considered Windows 8.1, and they are going to call Windows RT 8.1, interestingly enough. Basically renaming Windows RT to be in sync. And the naming convention of 8.1 is similar to what has been done in the past, such as Windows 3.1 being a major enhancement actually over Windows 3.0. And we've got some client and server updates coming as well. Server 2012 will likely be Server 2012 R2, matching past system upgrades there, or not upgrades, but system revisions. And there's going to be a Windows Phone Blue, possibly called Windows Phone 8.1. That would seem to be the logical choice there. We also have Outlook and SkyDrive and other services. Those are going to be called Services Blue. At least that's their initial code name. Of course, not the final name. And the server and services should come within a few months after the client is released. And Blue being more than just SP1 for Windows 8, Windows Blue or Windows 8.1 are akin to releases like Mountain Lion as it is to OS X, so basically major OS releases. So what will we see next after 8.1? Will we see 9, major revision of Windows, or will it be 8.2? Time will tell, though it seems like we may be in for another major release after that. New features and fixes will be part of Blue, so that makes it more than a service pack. Although in the past, Windows XP Service Pack 2 was actually more than just a service pack in that one instance. So we're going to move on now and see what is cooking in the stew.
Program complete. Enter when ready.
And our first news story is that of Bing. Bing malware. Bing will deliver you 5 times as many malicious websites as Google. According to German independent testing lab AV-Test, Bing returned 5 times as many malicious websites compared to Google. The study looked at nearly 40 million websites provided by 7 different search engines. 10 million came from Google, 10 million came from Bing, and of the 40 million sites, AV-Test found 5,000 pieces of malware. Google was the safest. Google returned a mere 272 malicious results in 10 million, and Bing returned 1,285 out of 10 million pages. So interesting use of search, or interesting result of comparing the search engines there with malware. Bing is just finding some interesting things, I suppose, but maybe they could use that as a way to or Yahoo could use that as a way to back out of that partnership with Microsoft. But at any rate, we move on to the next story, and that is that of a hacker has found a way to use an Android to remotely attack and hijack an airplane. Okay, well, we're speaking in a simulated sense here. During the presentation at Hack the Box conference in Amsterdam, security researcher Hugo Tesso detailed that it is possible to misdirect an airplane using an Android app called Planesploit. Tesso was able to feed false navigation information to a simulated jet that he'd built out of spare jet parts that he bought on eBay. He was able to control the steering of the jet while the plane was in autopilot mode. But some facts about this: the Automated Dependent Surveillance Broadcast, or ADS-B, has no security, as it was pointed out by DEFCON 20 shortly before a hacker was able to inject ghost planes into radar. It is unencrypted and unauthenticated. Tesso said attacks range from passive attacks, eavesdropping, to active attacks, message jamming, replaying, injection. The Aircraft Communications Addressing and Reporting System, ACARS, also has no security. It's used for exchanging text messages between aircraft and ground stations via radio, VHF, or satellite. Although his talk did not focus on the vulnerabilities in these two protocols, he used them to find targets. Tesso used his Samsung Galaxy and a specially crafted app called Planespoit to demonstrate how to hack an airplane's computer. So, great. Now everybody, including the attackers out there, know how to do the exploit. Well, not entirely. And we should also keep in mind that, of course, as we mentioned, this system has no security, and that if we start rolling out, people might immediately think that we're going to start banning PDA devices and such on planes. Well, this isn't just on a plane, it's anyone with this radio transmitter and has the hack ability. So it's sort of an interesting and scary possibility, but why they release it to the public and not into private domain, private security measures, is a little beyond me. Kind of an interesting story nonetheless. And moving on, we have Microsoft developing a 7-inch Surface coming later this year. The Wall Street Journal reports that Microsoft is, as we've speculated before, indeed developing a smaller version of its Surface tablet that will launch later this year. Microsoft recently altered the Windows 8 hardware requirements to permit smaller and cheaper screens. Wall Street Journal also reports Microsoft is working on its own phone, but was unclear on plans to bring it to market. Microsoft is building this smaller version of Surface. The original Surface is a 10.6-inch device. So it's not really a surprise when you consider the likes of Samsung and Google and Apple have had tablets launched around this size, although many that have used the Surface at 10.6 will say, hey, you know, this Surface at 10.6 is just right. If I go down any smaller, I might not really want to use the Surface. I don't know. I think there's a market for 7-inch and 10-inch. If you don't have as big a form factor, it can come in handy. But then again, a 10.6 inch is a little easier to navigate around on, view web pages and such. But they might get the price point down low enough to interest some people into jumping onto the Surface, pun intended. Whereas the higher cost of a 10.6, if indeed the prices are lower, make it a little more prohibitive. And we move on to some Xbox news. Next Xbox will take over your TV, interact with your cable box, and launch a wave of Skynet attacks of Terminator machines. Well, not quite, but the Verge reports the next Xbox will control your cable box. Citing multiple unnamed sources, The Verge says the next Xbox will have an HDMI pass-through similar to Google TV devices that will allow Microsoft to place an overlay UI on top of existing TV channels. This is supposed to be a key part of the next generation Xbox. Since Microsoft has partnerships with content providers, the Xbox would be able to go further than Google TV. The box will require, of course, we've mentioned this before, an always-on connection to use the entertainment services portion. The Next Gen Connect will also play a role in their TV. The Next Connect will detect multiple people and their eyes to pause content when a viewer turns their head away to cough. Well, when a viewer turns their head away from their TV. That's similar to something the Galaxy S4 does. I just wonder, do I really want the thing to pause because maybe I have a laptop or a tablet, such as a Surface, sitting next to me, and maybe I'm looking up information or doing something on the side while I'm watching the show, and if I turn my face away, well, that's going to be a problem because it's going to be pausing. Of course, there'll ultimately be a way to turn that off or maybe mitigate it. You'd think maybe in a combination of body motions as well, like if you're turned the whole way, maybe, I don't know. It could be good or bad. It's interesting. And with the eye tracking, you can ad content providers can take a look and see what people are actually watching their ads and drive content. So for them, that's a bonus. Interesting little concept there with Connect and eye tracking. But one thing that Microsoft does well is the interface in Xbox has been pretty nice, easy to use. It would be nice if they'd go a step further and maybe integrate searching for TV shows and movies over things like Netflix, Hulu, and so forth. And take it a step further, make it simpler to find what you want to find instead of going to 10 different sources. Basically becoming the entertainment hub for everything. So more than just a gaming console, an incentive to buy a new Xbox, perhaps. Alright, now we're going to move on to the main topic. And that is of software RAID. This is something that has interested me for a while. I've been wanting to take my gigantic box of 8 gazillion hard drives and a 12-port RAID controller that I have. It's a hardware RAID. Now, if you don't know what RAID is, it's essentially where you take a bunch of drives and hopefully you have them RAIDed in such a way that the information is protected. If one drive fails, for instance, the other ones remain active. You can do mirroring RAID. You can do RAID 5, RAID 6. RAID 6 allows for 2 drives to fail. RAID 5, 1 drive. Have 3 drives. 1 drive fails. All your data keeps going. Typically in hardware RAID, you have striping that goes across all the drives, such as RAID 5 and RAID 6. What that means is the parity, or the protected data, the information that is written across each disk, which makes it faster in essence. And so if one drive fails, you still have all your data, and your parity data is still there as well. But in traditional hardware RAID, if they all fail, like if you have RAID 5 and you have 3 disks and 2 of them fail, you're out of luck. There's really no way to recover the data, at least not easily, from that hardware RAID single drive that's left. So if you wanted to just salvage what was left there, you're pretty much out of luck. But so anyways, I have this hardware RAID set up with lots of disks. I wanted to get rid of it, put it in its own box, and maybe in another episode I'll outline some of the details on that. It's not that costly. In fact, it's cheaper than doing a standalone type box that might cost $500 or $600, like a Drobo, building your own small RAID server. In this case, we're talking NAS, network attached storage. So it's basically a server with an Ethernet cable, and then your other machines can access the information for movies and streaming content and things like that. And I looked at a lot of different options for a software RAID solution. So taking the RAID card out of the equation, going with software in this case, simplify the whole setup. And you got a few choices. You have FlexRAID, you have something called FreeNAS, you've got SnapRAID, unRAID. Of course, you have storage spaces with Windows if you have Windows 8 or Server 2012. You have something called MDADM if you're running Linux, or ZFS file system on Linux. And I put it all in a matrix. This is an extension of lots of digging around on the internet. And this is the matrix here, if you're watching the video feed. And there are various pros and cons for each, of course. I'm going to start off with storage spaces. If you have Windows 8 and or Server 2012, then you can already do RAID and NAS type setups in those operating systems because it comes with it. And storage spaces offers real-time protection. You can have a mix of size of drives. That's one of the key ingredients here with software RAID that you don't usually find in a hardware RAID. You have to have the exact same size of drive for your array of drives that you're putting together into your big giant storage volume. And that's one of the bonuses of software RAID, because in general they all, except for, as you can see in this chart, offer a mix of size of drives. FreeNAS and ZFS do not. Now, if any of this information is erroneous, I apologize, but this should be fairly accurate, taken from multiple sources from each one of these different offerings, from charts and so forth. And the RAID space, so you can have a mix of drives with storage spaces. It does do striping, depending on the type you're using. RAID space expansion, yes. What does that mean, RAID space expansion? Well, if you have 3 drives and you want to make your array bigger, your giant Z drive that has all of your movies on it, you want to go bigger, not a problem. With storage spaces, you can throw another drive in, click a button, and expand. Now the next question is how many disks are spinning. Now this is important to a lot of people because they're trying to build a server system that is low in power and doesn't use a whole lot of power. Now in some of the setups only 1 disk will spin at a time, and other ones they will all spin. Now since this is using striping, they will all spin in the case of storage spaces. Drive power down, that's questionable. I didn't really have a concise answer on storage spaces on that. I was guessing no because it's using striping. However, the entire array should power down after so much time. At least it did in the hardware RAID sense. Filled disks, can we start with some disks that are already have data and expand those and join them together? Not with storage spaces, no. If you read max parity with storage spaces, appears to be just 1 at this point. And there are some things called integrity checks, which may or may not be important. It checks file systems for integrity. It's questionable whether or not they're really useful in terms of actual protecting your data. Storage spaces doesn't do that. The read and write performance, it's right around 100 megabytes per second, and this is assuming SATA 3. And I have seen reports of only 15 to 40 when the parity checks are going on. So the performance has been poor for storage spaces compared to some of these other solutions. Of course, the cost here is free if you own the operating system. It has a GUI for an interface, and it was first released in 2012. And that is storage spaces. Now, if you're a Linux person, then you're ready to go. If you already have Linux running on your server and you have the ability to put multiple drives in there, then you can use the MDADM solution that is part of Linux, and you can have a mix of size of drives. It will do striping. It does do RAID space expansion. All the disks should be spinning in the case of the striping. Drives will power down after some time. And can you start with a filled disk in that situation? No. And the max parity here is 2. And typical read-write performance, I saw one report of a 6 drive getting between 200 and 450 megabytes per second. That's pretty consistent for that type of setup with striping. I was getting 700 with my RAID 6/7 drive array on hardware. That was pretty beefy and pretty fast, though. It was a pretty costly card. The cost, of course, is free if you have the Linux, and that one has both command line if you're a command line guru or GUI, and that's been around since 2001. And next up we have FreeNAS. Now FreeNAS is real-time redundancy, and you can't have a mix of types of drives. It offers striping with ZFS. That's a type of file system in Linux. RAID space expansion, no, but you can create a new pool. That's a whole complex area. I don't really want to get into it in this podcast, but the typical easy add a drive expand won't happen with FreeNAS. You have to create a whole new pool, a pool of drives. The disk spinning there is all of them. You can power them down after so much time. You cannot start with a filled disk in that situation, and you can have 3 parity protection there. And typical performance here, this is just one instance here, 150 to 300 megabytes per second with a RAID 0 4 disk. That RAID 0, incidentally, does not have parity when you're dealing with RAID 0. That's strictly for speed. A RAID Z2 4 disk coming in around 100 on some reports. The operating systems here: Linux, Mac, Solaris, BSD, GUI. Been around since 2011. And next up is, I'm going to skip to the left here and go right to unRAID. unRAID uses real-time protection, meaning your parity data is backed up in real time. You don't have to take scheduled snapshots like you do with some of these. You can have a mix of drives and some single disk parity, I should say. No striping with unRAID. RAID space expansion, yes you can, and number of disks spinning is only 1 with unRAID. Drive powers down, of course. Filled disk, not in the case of unRAID. And you can have a max parity of 1 here, and you're getting between 90 and 130 megabytes per second, pretty much on par with a single disk performance there. Cost, this one isn't free. It's between 69 and 119, and that is on Linux, incidentally. And then if we move on, that was unRAID, and we move on to SnapRAID. SnapRAID is going to use snapshot. What does snapshot mean? As I mentioned, it is a scheduled time where you back up the data basically into the parity disk, and that can use a mix of size of drives, and striping is just, there's no striping, it's just single disk parity there. RAID space expansion, you certainly can. Drives will power down. You only have 1 drive spinning, so it's good on performance as far as power goes, I mean. Of course, you can read the disks if your parity fails. That's the nice thing about SnapRAID and unRAID and FlexRAID, those 3 in particular. We'll get to FlexRAID next. Max parity here is about 2. Typical read-write performance, your typical single disk performance of 90 to 130 megabytes per second. It's free, and it's available on Linux and Windows, Mac, OpenIndiana, Solaris, and BSD. And command line or elucidate. Being fancy there. Anyways, that is SnapRAID. Now for the one I favored here, FlexRAID. This is the one I'm actually running, and I have been tooling with here for a few weeks now. This uses both. You can either do snapshot or real time. You have a choice. And incidentally, if you look on our website, there is a how-to guide on how to set up FlexRAID. I put up there not too long ago. You can have a mix of size of drives. Striping, no. Single disk parity in this case. Multiple parity disks, up to 3 in fact. Number of disks spinning, 1 disk spinning here. Drives will power down. You can start with a filled disk and read that data. You can read data if it fails, and you'll get between 70 and 130. Well, it says 110 here, but I've gotten up to 130 even with parity checks going on. And the cost here between 40 and 60 depending on which option you take on their website. I paid the 60 and got both the storage pooling and RAID ability. This will run on Windows or Linux. Be prepared to tinker a lot when you first start with FlexRAID. It might be the case with most of these, but in my case I was tinkering and having a few issues here and there. Once I ironed those out and got to a pretty good understanding of the system, that went away. Everything is working. I have scheduled snapshots going on. In the case of FlexRAID, I schedule a nightly update, which only takes a few seconds for my data. For data that doesn't change a whole lot, it's only going to take a few seconds to a few minutes to update the data every night. And then you have your validation and your verifies. Validation typically every week. You validate, make sure data is accurate, and your verify, make sure it's verified and can be restored if you need to. If you run into errors there, then you have to redo your parity and make sure everything is working correctly, or make sure there aren't bad blocks on your existing drives and that sort of thing. So that's the grand rundown there. I'll just show the chart here one more time. So what it boils down to is, are you a Linux pro? Do you want to just use MDADM built in? You can turn it into a GUI if you need to in that case. Do you want something a little simpler with a little more flexibility in terms of reading and writing data? In terms of reading data, when a parity drive fails completely, you still have access to it. That's one of the beauties of FlexRAID and unRAID and SnapRAID. And I kind of like that myself. Although I've never had a RAID array completely fail on the hardware sense. Then you got to weigh out whether you want real-time parity or snapshot. Typically parity will drag your system down a bit, make your throughput a little less on those hard drives. But if you're streaming Blu-ray movies and that sort of thing, any one of these is going to do well. You can expect, you know, like a Blu-ray will peak at about 50 megabits per second. That's only about 6 megabytes per second if the math was done correctly there. If you have a gigabit Ethernet connection at home, you're going to be pumping out 120 maximum megabytes per second, although with overhead on the line it's more like 80 or somewhere in there. Plenty of overhead unless you're running like 20 Blu-ray movies at once from a server like this. Now if you're using it for backup, then, well, even then it doesn't really matter as much because it's just a backup source, destination I should say. More on the hardware in another episode, but that's the gist of software RAID that exists out there. That's what you'll be looking at if you start diving into that area for a software RAID solution. I'll try to get a article up there with some of this information in this chart in the coming days here. But we move on to some science, and the first story is that of NASA. NASA wants to catch an asteroid. NASA wants to catch it, put it in orbit around the moon. It really does. And it sounds like science fiction, but it's actually part of President Barack Obama's proposed federal budget for the next fiscal year, according to a Florida senator. The recent threats and like the Russian meteor have really kind of pushed these type of studies forward, So NASA is planning to catch it with a robotic spacecraft and tow it back toward Earth, where it will be placed in a stable orbit around the moon. And how they're going to catch it is outlined in an animation. This one you can see here. Take a look at that animation. The astronauts will travel to where the asteroid is towed to, and they could do mining activities, research into ways of deflecting an asteroid from striking Earth, testing it to develop a technology for a trip to deep space and Mars. Such things as, extracting the ingredients you need to make fuel right off the asteroid. A lot of good practice by having a robot go grab one of these, bring it closer so we can get to work and get going towards heading towards Mars and towards finding ways to deflect these asteroids. So it's a really good idea. NASA's plan is similar to one that was suggested last year by experts at the California Institute of Technology, and that plan proposed bringing a 500-ton asteroid closer to Earth, not a small one such as this. And as you can see in the animation, the one proposed method has it expanding a sort of a catching tube, if you will, where it then encapsulates it inside of there and pulls it home. So Obama is supporting NASA's plan, including about $100 million in the budget to kick it off. And he still wants to send astronauts to an asteroid for the first time by 2025. But NASA would bump that date up by 4 years to 2021. And that for us is 8 years into the future. Sounds like far off, but it really isn't. The proposal may have gotten an unexpected boost, like we mentioned, back in February when the asteroid exploded over Russia. And that is the plan, to grab the asteroid and bring it closer to home so we can get to work on heading outward into the solar system. Well, let's move on to some flight stew for this week. So what have we got in the flight stew for this week? Well, we've got Orbx in Southern Alaska. I'm a big fan of Orbx FTX products, and they have a new one called NA Blue Southern Alaska. That is from Orbx's full terrain lineup. Here we can see a screenshot, one of them from Southern Alaska. We take a look at the coverage map too. I took this right off of Google Earth. They have a KMZ that you can find out there on the web. It'll show you everything covered in that region of Southern Alaska, and that's a pretty good swath of coverage. That lineup, it stretches from Anchorage to Juneau along the southern coast of Alaska. Canadian flyers will also be pleased to know that not insubstantial areas of their states bordering the area will be included as well. So you get more than just Southern Alaska, you get the perimeter areas. Here's a video clip of the area here too as well. Just absolutely stunning. I just can't say enough good things about their products. They really produce a good overlay on the cake that is Flight Sim X, if you will. And this is pretty good icing on the cake. Outstanding. And I gotta say that Flight Sim X really hums with a GTX 670, but more on that in another episode. I also upgraded video card to a GTX 670 from an ATI 5850, and that was a double the performance in terms of 3D Mark 11. And now with the GTX 670, my average frame rate when it locked at 30 frames per second is closer to that 30 holy grail, even with clouds and weather and that sort of thing, whereas before it would dip down into the upper teens, low 20s, that sort of thing. It's one heck of a card. It's really amazing. Plus you get the 3D ability with the card too, stereo 3D. So at any rate, you can acquire this for around $33 online, and that is Orbx Southern Alaska. Now here's a add-on for Flight Sim that you may not have heard of because it seems to be rather recently released in general, and this is the first release from this company called SunSkyJet, KPHL, that's Philadelphia International Airport. It's freeware, and the scenery is as good as a lot of payware. And here is it has nighttime textures too, as you can see. Pretty outstanding. Here's a video clip from KPHL. I haven't had a chance to download this yet, but I definitely will. Looks like they just came into a Facebook page only about a month ago, so you can check them out on Facebook. They have some other areas in the works as well, doing some good stuff for the flight sim community. KPHL, Philadelphia International Airport. So crank out the flight sims, and there we go. So let's move on to the picks and tips of the week. What do I have for picks and tips this week? Well, up first we've got Feedly. In case you're not aware, Google has done away with its Google Reader for RSS news feeds, and come July it will cease to exist. You can go out to Google Reader right now and you can back up your feeds to a file that you can download, and then at the same time you can go and check out Feedly. That's Feedly.com. If you go to feedly.com, it'll install a Chrome plugin. It's available for iOS, Android, and Kindle as well. It's basically a replacement for Google Reader. It'll import your Google Reader feeds, and it'll look something like this once it does so. And a nice interface in the front, easy to read. Frankly, a great deal better than the Google Reader was, I would have to say and admit. Now, the other pick for the week is the universe. Go out and explore the universe and find out what scale it's on. If you go to this website, which I'll put in the show notes, you can take a look at the Zoomable Universe in a browser. It puts everything in perspective. And you start off closer to home, and they give you an idea of perspective, such as in this case the Minecraft world compared to Neptune and Uranus, and then you can move on out until you see the entire universe and the observable universe. It's a fun little thing, educational tool, if you will, and that's on htwins.net or htwins.net/scale2. Again, I'll have a link in the show notes for that guy. And that is all I've got for picks of the week. So that's about it for this episode of Text2, episode 34. And it's going to wrap it up, but remember to keep on cooking with tech, and we will see you next time in the stew that is Text2.